Welcome everyone to today's National Network of Libraries of Medicine webinar. It's good that you're all here. I'm especially grateful to everyone, Marissa who's presenting, and then also to everyone who helped set this up. It wouldn't have been possible without that, so thank you. My name is Rachel Gatewood, and I'm an instructional designer with the Community Engagement Network in the Greater Midwest region and with the NNLM Training Office. And I'll be serving as your host today for the Kernel of Knowledge session. A couple of housekeeping notes, as you might have already noticed. You're automatically muted on entry into this webinar, so please put questions in the chat panel. You can select who gets the question, so even if the question is for our presenter, please mark them for all participants because my colleague Rebecca and I will be collecting them as the presentation goes, because we'll save the questions until the end to respond. A couple of other things, we will post this video. It's going to be recorded and will be posted on the National Network of Libraries of Medicine YouTube page for future viewing and reference within the next week or so. And this session is being live captioned. Rebecca did just put a link in, but just in case you came in, we'll put it in again, and we'll keep putting it in just so that everyone, if anybody comes in late, can access the link for live captioning. And finally, there'll be a 1 credit of continuing education offered for this. And so at the end of this, you'll have the opportunity to fill out evaluation, and then you will be able to access the code for that continuing education credit. And so unless there are any other questions, we can get started with the introduction. Are there any questions at this point? Okay, I see no questions in the chat. Then let's move on to the introduction of our guest, who I am thrilled that we are hosting today. All right. So, Marissa Cummings is a member of the Omaha Tribe and currently the Director of Native Student Services at the University of South Dakota. Prior to this appointment, she served her people as the Chief of Tribal Operations for the Omaha Tribe of Nebraska and Iowa. Marissa also served as an administrator for Little Priest Tribal College and worked in diversity recruitment and retention efforts at the University of Iowa for 9 years. She has worked in higher education for over 14 years and is dedicated to Indigenous models of governance, education, food systems, ceremonies, and sovereignty. Marissa earned her Bachelor of Arts degree in American Studies from the University of Iowa, with a minor in American Indian Native Studies. She is currently pursuing her Master's in Tribal Administration and Governance from the University of Minnesota Duluth. Marissa has 4 children and lives with her partner on her people's ancestral homelands in Sioux City, Iowa. Marissa has been working with the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Movement as part of her advocacy for dismantling systems of oppression that impact our Native communities. And with that, we would like to turn things over to Marissa and welcome her today. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm just going to open up this chat box too so I can see if there are any questions that come along as we go. So as Rachel said, the topic today is missing and murdered Indigenous women, and I just really wanted to thank everyone who's taken the time to be in the session today and to hear more about awareness around missing and murdered Indigenous women. I wanted to start with my community. I am Omaha, as we say Omaha, and that's always my frame of reference because I can only speak for myself and my family. I can't speak for any other community. So I wanted to start with some history, and then we'll lead up into more of a contemporary movement. But I wanted to start with some history and also some federal Indian policies so that we can see how we've gotten to where we are today and then what's being done today. So in our traditional societies, there was a balance of power between women. Okay, I hear there's audio jumbled. Can everyone hear me okay?
Marissa, this is Rebecca. You sound good to me.
Okay. Okay, it sounds like it's okay on my end. Okay.
Can I just interrupt one more time? For the person who finds it jumbled, you may want to call in, and I will put that information in the chat box.
Okay, thank you. So when we talk about women in traditional societies, we're looking at more of a balance of power. So in my community, we were patrilineal, which means that our children followed their father's clanship. However, we're matrilocal or a matriarchal society in terms of how women had decision-making power. Women in my community owned the home. They were considered, if you saw owning as it was a different concept, obviously, but the space of the woman was the home and the children, as well as everything she made. So as you see in these pictures, we are dressed very beautifully, and a lot of that came from a woman's skill set. And so she owned all of the things that she made, all the hides that she tanned. So there was a great sense of agency. In the bottom left-hand picture, this is the governor at the time of the state of Nebraska, and one of our grandmothers shaking his hand, and she was actually what we call like a mark of honor woman, which is a woman in a leadership position that also had certain traditional roles that they did, but she's there shaking the hand of the governor and representing the people. In the next picture, we see a woman with a horse, and you can see all of the items that she has on the horse that she's made. So you really see a sense of agency there in terms of her and her relationship with the things around her. In the next picture, I really like this picture because in a lot of the older photographs, you see the women standing up and the men sitting down. And in most other pictures, it's framed differently, where the woman would sit down and the man would stand up. And I think part of that was also to show her regalia that she was wearing in her outfit. And then in the last picture, we see women on a horse ride. And so you see these beautiful blankets that the women are wearing as well as their clothes, which is a sign in our community, would be a sign of like of wealth, in a sense that women have the ability to create a lot of those items that they have. When we look at women and men's roles, we're looking at, again, a balance of life forces. So everything in our community is really about achieving balance, which is a constant thing that humans strive for. But women's roles centered around agriculture, which was the economy, based in planting and processing, as well as cooking the food. But if you think of women as seed keepers, so we know now that throughout the world, Indigenous people supply over 80% of the food that's used in the world today. So what's now known as the Americas was actually a huge agricultural basin, and specifically the Missouri River Valley Basin that my community comes from. So planting, hybriding these different varieties of foods was very much an economy and a trade economy. Women also centered around delivering children, raising children, the practices and medicines that went along with that, and also butchering, tanning hides, and artistic work. And I put that in there because a lot of times there's a stereotype that we were just kind of out hunting buffalo and we're just trying to survive, and that did come later on after contact. But the reality is that the communities were wealthy in terms of what they did have. So the cradle boards, homes, baskets, mats, pottery, blankets. There were actually textiles pre-contact. So a lot of those things that women were supplying their communities. And then men's roles centered more around labor, so and also governance roles and title holders. Although the women also had a voice in terms of how their husbands and their brothers and their fathers voted in terms of tribal governance. Men did a lot of building, a lot of hunting and fishing, and then teaching the younger men their coming of age ceremonies and also warfare. There we go. So when we switch to, and I'm going to go into contact, and this is a lot of content, so I understand if it's, I'm going to try and go slowly, but if anybody needs me to stop and clarify something, please put that in the chat box. But there is a direct correlation between the rape of the land and the rape of the women after contact. And I put these pictures up here because so often the pictures of our people are after contact, when we are starving or we're decimated, and rarely do we see this beauty of the way that people lived. And so I really wanted to share that in terms of the fruits, the melons, the squash, the corn, the beans, all of those things that we were growing, as well as the relationships between women and their children, which was a really beautiful bond. So when we go into, before we go into context, I wanted to talk about the doctrine of discovery, which is rarely touched upon, I think, in the U.S. But the doctrine was a series of papal bulls issued through the Catholic Church and promulgated by European monarchs. And basically what it said, basically what they all said when they came together was that Europeans had the right to title of land upon contact if they displayed their flag and if the inhabitants would not Christianize. So this justified the murder, enslavement, and torture of all non-Christian people throughout the world. And so this doctrine is so powerful because it became part of the United States Foundation. So in 1792, Thomas Jefferson declared that the doctrine of discovery would extend into the new government of the United States. And so would that legacy of imperialism. It continued in 1823 with the doctrine of discovery being incorporated into United States federal law through the Marshall Trilogy, which was a series of Supreme Court cases. But Johnson versus McIntosh was especially powerful because it decided that Native people had the right of occupancy, but not the right to land title. So they could live there, they just could be moved, or the land could be sold, and they couldn't sell the land. So that was kind of the concept of Johnson v. McIntosh. So when we look at violence against women, we know that Columbus didn't land in what's now called the Americas, right? He landed in the Caribbean. But I wanted to touch on the mentality that was promulgated through the doctrine of discovery. So these are direct quotes from Columbus's journal in 1500. So they were going out looking for and trafficking young women ages 9 and 10 years old at that time. This was part of, it was so normal that they even wrote it in their journals. And so I think it's really important to think about that initial contact and what that looked like for Indigenous peoples. Again, in one of the journals of one of Columbus's voyagers, he talks and explicitly describes the rape of a Carib woman. And these are, again, direct quotes from the journals itself. And so it's, I think it's really important to look at how this evolved into missing and murdered Indigenous women today. And I wanted to touch on settler colonialism. I'm not going to read the definition because I think you all, can read that yourselves. But what I do want to talk about is how colonialism destabilizes traditional models of governance and economics. And so when you had women that were in positions of agency and autonomy in their communities, and now that's being destabilized, it destabilizes the entire community. And basically the culture of the people that are there. Colonization induces warfare, which centralizes power to men. It destabilizes traditional economies and trade networks, which isolate communities from their allies, and that was part of the reservation system. It attacks the balance and stability of basic life, which causes trauma. And now we talk a lot about historical trauma in Indigenous communities. And a lot of that is what we deal with in the healing process of families and communities that are affected by missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and people in general. Colonization induced systematic economic and government policies and practices that encouraged violence towards Native women and girls, including trafficking and rape. And I'll talk in more detail about that. And colonization induced systematic economic and governmental policies and practices that led to genocide. And I'll talk a little bit more about how the end result is always access to land and resources. So I'm going to quickly go through historical eras. And the fur trade era was one that was existing throughout, Canada and what's now known as Canada and the United States. But one of the things that's so powerful about the fur trade to me is that Native women were the experienced tanners. We were the ones tanning the hides. We were the ones that were the sole basic part of that economy, whereas the men were traveling distance to trade the furs. The women, again, were the tanners and had the skill set, yet they're completely omitted from historical documentation. Also, during the fur trade era, we see an influx of people coming from Europe and setting up trade forts, and without women. And so there was a need for women. And so Native women were being raided and sold to brothels. When there was intertribal conflicts that were happening, women were being kidnapped and sold. Women were being raided in warfare and actually sent on the triangular slave trade. So there's Native women that were being sent to the Caribbean, that were being sent to Europe. And it was really kind of a status thing in Europe at the time to have a Native woman slave in your home. But they rarely lived very long. So that was the fur trade era. And then we'll go into the reservation allotment period. So the Dawes Act of 1887 was actually, my tribe was the tribe that they experimented on. And so allotment was written into our 1857 treaty. And what allotment meant is that basically the land was going to be divided up for individual families. And originally they only wanted men, but the women in our community raised so much heck about it that they sent the men back, and they had to renegotiate so that women and men could both have land title or an allotment. And then the interesting thing that happened during this time is that they were redefining households. So with the allotment of land, the man was now the head of the household and owned the woman and the children, and just as it was in mainstream American society at that time. So it destabilized women's traditional roles and men's traditional roles in a way that we're still recovering from today, and trying to renegotiate what our relationships look like between men and women. Also, a big part of that was the boarding school era that was happening simultaneously. And so some of you this picture is a picture of Carlisle Indian School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. That is where my great-grandfather, he was a hereditary chief in our clan, and he was taken there along with his brother Fred. And basically they prepared the men to be in military. The children, both girls and boys, were rented out to local farmers for a fee, but the children never received the money, so it was essentially slave labor. And their hair was cut, they were forced to speak English, and it was a very, very traumatic experience. Part of that, it was a man by the name of Pratt who started Carlisle, and the thought behind it was kill the Indian and save the man. So again, we're looking at access to land base for settlers, and to do that we need to assimilate Indigenous people into the mainstream world. And part of that was the boarding school era. And this happened for generations. My grandmother also was sent to Haskell Indian Boarding School. It was actually called the U.S. Indian Boarding School at Haskell. So it was a generational trauma. But part of that also was that a lot of young girls were coming up pregnant, either by boys there or by staff. And this is something that many of our communities are just now starting to address, the traumas that happened with sexual violence at the boarding schools, or even when they were rented out over the summer, there was sexual violence that happened. So that there was a lot of trauma associated with the boarding school era. Relocation and termination. In a lot of ways, we're creating vulnerable groups, is the way that I would put it, right? So if children are in a boarding school, their parents aren't there, there's no one to protect them, that's a vulnerable population. And so I like to say that we aren't at risk, we were specifically targeted. And that was just seen in the boarding school experience that I just talked about, but also with relocation and termination. You're targeting a community that you want to assimilate mainstream so you have access to land. And during relocation and termination, Congress began so Congress is the only authority that has the right to terminate or change a treaty. So congressional authority is the only way that changes can be made to treaty agreements. And so Congress began terminating its trust responsibility to tribes that were located in certain states, and then specific tribes that they thought were doing well economically and that they no longer wanted to adhere to their trust responsibility for. And part of that was to move families into the city. They promised jobs, they promised housing, they promised opportunities, and we're in an era where people are just now recovering from a lot of the period of extreme poverty in the communities in the 30s. So a lot of families like my own, my grandmother moved to, she moved to Sioux City. Some families moved to Denver, Minneapolis, San Diego. A lot of families moved to the city to the point where today almost 75% of Native people live in urban areas. But what it also continued to do was create a vulnerable population of women who were in cities without support systems, without their community. A lot of times they knew English, but they still had a very strong accent. And so when they were sent for jobs, these jobs ended up being in factories or domestic work in urban areas. So my grandmother was trained in nursing when she was at boarding school. And when she got out in Sioux City, she could only find a job doing housekeeping in hotels. And so that was, my grandmother's very dark-skinned too, so easily identifiable. So that was a big part of what was happening to many of our communities, and it created a group that lived in poverty. And also, they were often put into housing projects. Another piece that really came to light at this time, although I think it was happening before then, is eugenics or forced sterilization. And it was widely practiced at Indian Health Services facilities specifically. And what would happen is, like, I remember my grandma telling a story of one of her relatives that went in to have a baby. And back then they would gas them when they were having babies. So she was kind of out, she was knocked out. And when she came to, they said the baby had passed away and she could never have another child. And she found out many years later that they had given her a hysterectomy. And we don't know to this day, was there a baby or was there not a baby? We don't know. That baby could have been born and adopted out, which was also a common practice. So that type of trauma, a lot of the families rarely talk about, but now I think enough people have done the work in gathering these stories to know that they were commonly practiced. And there's also evidence of it being practiced at the hospitals themselves. So I want to touch on environmental assaults as well on Native women. There was something called the Flood Control Act of 1944, which led to a damming project on the Missouri River specifically that started at the headwaters up in North Dakota and came all the way down the Missouri and affected many, many tribes. And what it did is it changed the actual river. They moved the river. And so the Missouri River for many of our communities was the treaty boundary, was the river. So when it moved, they moved in a way, or they moved it intentionally in a way that we lost thousands of acres of land in my tribe alone. And there were subsequent lawsuits where we were able to obtain some more land. So there's a certain amount of land that we have in the state of Iowa now as a result of those lawsuits. But this was happening intentionally, flooding out native agricultural sites. So at this time, it was destabilizing our way of feeding ourselves, and it created more dependency on the United States government for commodities and food sources. And it was eventually, like, we know it was illegal, right? It was unconstitutional, and it violated federal trust relationship with the tribes. In addition to that, it had either a known or unknown effect, which is that many of our women's ceremonies are done by the water and by the river. So women are the caretakers of water. In every Native community I know on the Mississippi, or the Missouri, that's how it is, and probably the Mississippi too. Our women are the ones that work with the water and know that as a life source, because just like seeds, women are the ones who produce life and therefore have that connection. So when this happened to the river, we call her Nishude. I know the English word is Missouri, but when they did this, we lost ceremonial and sacred sites all over by the river. And there was a specific cave that went underwater that my grandma remembered the grandmothers going down and performing ceremony at and singing. And now that place is no longer there because the river was moved, like I said. So that, as a result of that, all of these years of trauma, then there comes Standing Rock, which happened recently. And so I wanted to give that background so that we understand how we are where we are today in terms of the movement, and a larger movement to reclaim our space as Native women as well. That happened at Standing Rock, where in the top photo you actually see, this is in Omaha, Nebraska at the Army Corps of Engineers, who Ace is actually the one who created the dams and is supposed to control the river and allowed for the pipeline, Trans-Canada Pipeline, to be built specifically over land and through land that was considered ceremonial and sacred. And part of this too was reclaiming our space as women and as protectors of the river. And so in the bottom picture you see one of our grandmothers. Her name's Glenna Slater, and she was my grandmother's best friend as children and a fluent speaker. And so she was the one who opened up the prayer, and this was in Omaha, Nebraska, on our historical homeland. So reclaiming that space as women it was a really strong part of fighting the environmental assaults that are happening to what we call our Earth Mother as well. So I wanted to feed into the role of man camps, pipelines, and missing and murdered. I'll let you read through this, but essentially, as man camps, I'm going to tell a story too. I wasn't going to tell, but I think I'm going to tell it. One of the action sites when we were fighting Trans-Canada, and it was coming through Iowa as well, and one of the action sites we went to protest, my daughter was currently a master's student at the University of Michigan. She came home to visit, and I was like, well, what else are we going to do? Let's go to this protest. So we drove about an hour and a half to the site. And as we were walking to the actual site where we were going to demonstrate, a man that worked for the oil company drove by in his pickup truck, and he said, "How much for the little girl?" And I think he was, trying to incite us or upset us, but that really shows the mentality of people or men that are coming from areas like his plate said Texas. We got a picture of his license plate. And this actually was recorded and it went on to social media and a bunch of people saw it. But even if he was baiting us, that is the mindset that happens at man camps. Both of my brothers also worked at a man camp up in Minot, North Dakota, and came back with stories of what was happening there in terms of crime. And we also know through documentation there was a woman who was a police officer in North Dakota who documented the cases of women being raped and trafficked through the man camps, and then all of a sudden she lost her job. So there's a lot of work to be done, but we know from our communities that this is definitely one of the issues with man camps and why we fight the pipelines. I don't think everybody understands all of the areas and the issues that come with the pipelines in our communities or near our communities. This is a picture of what a man camp looks like. So they're essentially these white trailers that are brought in, and I believe this one might even be Canada, North Dakota, Canada area. But you hear a lot of like no more stolen sisters or no more man camps. Those are kind of the taglines that go along with them because of the extraction of resources. And when we talk about extraction of resources, we talked about the fur trade, right? We talked about children being extracted from their homes and their culture, their community, their grandparents. We talked about all these ways that women are extracted and the resources of the land are extracted as well. And it's almost like we go hand in hand. As the Indigenous people here, we're the stewards of the land. We're connected to her. She's our mother. And so that connection is so strong that as she is violated, our women are often violated as well. I wanted to quickly explain jurisdiction, and now this is going to cover a lot. We're going into a lot of content, but I also want to leave plenty of room at the end for everyone to be able to ask questions. Jurisdiction is really complicated when it comes to MMIW, and part of that is because tribes are, they call it the 7 Major Crimes Act, but there's actually more like 13 crimes that fit into it now that the feds have jurisdiction over. So if on tribal land a woman is, say she's murdered on tribal land, that is a federal investigation. So the state has no jurisdiction over the tribe, and the tribe can't do its own investigation into a murder because that becomes a federal crime. If a woman from a tribal community, say myself, was murdered in Sioux City, Iowa, that's under state jurisdiction. And there may be no communication with the state and the tribal community as to what's going on in terms of the investigation. So there's a lot of confusion and a lot of conflict around jurisdiction. Also, non-Native people have, Native communities have no jurisdiction over non-Native people. So if a non-Native person comes onto the reservation to commit a crime, like I said, that would be a federal crime, or a state, it would actually go into state jurisdiction, and then the feds would also come in and investigate. But there's often miscommunication between the two. So as we talk about building databases, so a lot of this presentation does not have data in it because the data is still being created. There's so many loopholes in requiring data, and that's what we'll go into some legislation a little bit later on. But jurisdiction is a major problem. Foster care is also almost a funnel for missing and murdered Indigenous children. And the states with the highest numbers of it being disproportional to the number of American Indian children or Native children in the foster care system are listed here. In Nebraska specifically, it's 9 times the average, and I know in Minnesota, I want to say it's 20 times the average. So we're looking at Native children being disproportionately funneled into the foster care system, and then they kind of, we don't know where they go later, right? So we know in Omaha, Nebraska specifically, a lot of the children that are there that are missing were actually through the foster care system. They ran away, or somehow there was a disconnect that happened in the system. So that's another area where there's a lot more research that's being done. So in terms of state legislation, this past legislative session, 3 states that I know of, there may be more, passed legislation about missing and murdered. So in Nebraska, they authorized the reporting in a study. So no action, but there's a study that they authorized. In South Dakota, they actually did pass procedures for the investigation of missing and murdered Indigenous persons. And in North Dakota, they went a little deeper. And I really think North Dakota should be the kind of the platform for what we look at with legislation. They actually established through the Human Trafficking Commission a way to look at law enforcement training specifically, and then also creating a database, which is really what we need to start happening. And we need more communication between state, local, and tribal law enforcement. Some federal legislation, VAWA is the Violence Against Women Act, and there's a section of VAWA that VAWA just is up now, I think, for reauthorization, and they are refusing to reauthorize VAWA in general because there's a piece of VAWA that says that tribal courts have the ability to try non-Native offenders. So I just told you about that, how in tribal communities you cannot prosecute a non-Native person in tribal courts. Well, the loophole for that would be through VAWA, that if a non-Native offender on a reservation in a domestic violence case, not a murder, but in a DV case, the tribal courts could prosecute them. And because of that, they do not want to pass VAWA because they feel like it gives tribes too much authority, I guess, to prosecute non-Native offenders of domestic violence on tribal land. So that's an issue. Also, tribal courts have to meet certain stipulations to be eligible. And part of those stipulations require that they have a legally trained public defender. And many tribal courts are severely underfunded by the BIA, and they simply can't afford to do that. In addition to VAWA, there was little to no tribal consultation. And so tribal consultation is actually mandated through law, that when there's, obviously, especially when you're creating a law that is about Native people, you definitely want to have some information or feedback from the tribes. Another federal legislation coming through is Savannah's Act, which also has not been passed yet. And this bill is kind of targeting the DOJ and looking at very specific actions that need to be taken. One of the things that we've been saying for a long time is that the federal government, the FBI, needs to be in charge of a database. And the FBI needs to be working with both state and tribal entities to make sure that there's communication on both sides. So that's something that we hope would be an outcome to Savannah's Act. Although I do know some people that were just in DC at a listening session, and they were trying to create more Bureau of Indian Affairs police officers, which we don't need more police officers. We need the FBI to create a database and be able to work within that. I see the comment on jurisdiction and how convenient that is for perpetrators. Absolutely. And not only is it convenient, but it attracts perpetrators, specifically in our schools. And that's a whole nother situation. The Not Invisible Act is also something that Deb Haaland, who's one of the first Native American congresswomen, has, along with Norma Torres and Ms. Cortez Mastro, they have, it's kind of like a supplement to Savannah's Act. So this bill is supposed to create the intergovernment coordination that I just talked about to combat the violence on Indian land. And so all of this is heavy, and all of it is not, it's hard stuff to listen to. And so to balance that, we also try and create awareness activities that are for, that can uplift and build community. And so Anita Lucchesi is a PhD student now. I think she's at Berkeley. She lives in California. And she developed, mapping is her area of expertise, and she created this digital map in working with MMIW. And she made the map look like a ribbon skirt, because ribbon skirts are kind of a fad now in Indian country, and they also have historical significance within certain communities. And so she wanted each of the colors to represent a form of violence that leads to women going missing or being murdered. And so pink represents girls under the age of 18, teal represents sexual assault, purple, domestic violence, red, I believe, shoot, I can't remember all the colors right now, but each one represents one of those ways that women become basically targeted or more easily hurt, or the violence happens easier. On the right-hand side, you see what we did an event here at the University of South Dakota to bring awareness for our students. We brought Anita in to do a guest lecture, and as part of that, we did an activity. So sewing, beading, doing traditional crafts is a big part of our identity as a people. And so the students actually made the skirts that Anita had created digitally, and were able to learn how to make ribbon skirts in the process. And then on the left-hand side, you see the students and myself actually wearing the skirts with Anita, and we gifted her a skirt as well. And she didn't even have a skirt that looked like the map that she made. So that was a way for us to empower ourselves, build community, and bring awareness all at the same time. Also, this is the Meskwaki. So this was a rally, awareness rally that they had at the state capitol in Des Moines, Iowa. And so myself and some others were included in that. And this was really led by the Meskwaki community and their DV program there. And they actually have a tribal member named Rita Papaki who has gone missing and is presumed to be murdered. And so this was really also about her. So that was my first time doing awareness work. that was also with a family there that had gone through this trauma and this tragic experience, and that was really emotional for me, and it really framed the work that we're doing. And when I say we, I mean there's so many Native women that have been doing this work since time immemorial. We have stories of our grandmas and our aunties creating domestic violence. Their homes were the domestic violence shelters, you know, back in the day. And there were women that were taking care of each other. And so this isn't anything new. I think it's just getting more publicity now that we have social media and other ways of connecting Indigenous communities to each other as well. So this was an awareness event. This was another event that was held in Reno, Nevada, or it was in Reno, Nevada. So in Reno, there are several tribal communities small communities within the state, and they did an amazing job developing this conference around the theme of Silent No More. And Silent No More really came from Canada. It was probably about 10 years ago now where Canadian women started, there were so many Canadian women going missing and being found murdered that they said, you know, we're not being quiet anymore, and they started really creating more social justice movements around that. So they invited myself, there's the Spotted Eagle, Ruth Buffalo, and a lot of other amazing speakers that were there to talk about exactly what happens, and it was a very powerful conference. I also wanted to talk a little about feminism and missing and murdered. So like I said before, like Native women, it's not like we're just sitting back letting this happen, right? We have been leading this movement for generations. And what we really need is allies to ensure they're not taking over space unwelcomed or uninvited, but that they're advocating for us in their own settings, you know, at the dinner table, at talking to people about this, bringing awareness and carrying that message with them. That's really what we need our allies to do. And I've seen that happen in really beautiful ways lately. So we definitely encourage that involvement. If people don't know how to help, just ask, what can I do? And there's definitely ways that we can collaborate and work together. So I went a little over how much time I wanted to do, but are there any questions that anyone has at this time about other thoughts? I know that was a lot of content. I'll speak while you guys are thinking. I'm going to speak about one event that we're looking at hosting now. It's in the very beginning infant planning stages at the University of South Dakota, but we're looking at hosting a missing and murdered Indigenous women's catalyst gathering for the region. So bringing together tribal communities and facilitating space for them to talk about best practices, what's working, what's not working, and that way we're not creating this institutional, you know, colonialism where we're telling anyone what to do, but we're just creating space to allow for that conversation to take place, and hopefully bringing in some really powerful speakers, which includes Sarah Deer. So I see this comment about 2 books that are recommended. Absolutely, Sarah Deer has done incredible work, and we're hoping to bring her here next October. So that's awesome. The Beginning and End of Rape is definitely a good book for anyone interested in. It touches on in beautiful detail about a lot of the things that I had talked about. Yeah, and thank you for your comment about the pipelines and the crimes. Yeah, Alaska has an incredible, Alaska's a really interesting place because Alaska is there's so many remote places in Alaska. There's a lot of crimes that are happening that are going unreported. So again, a lot of this data collection really comes into the issue. How do medical organizations mobilize around the issue? The one thing I would do, no matter where you're at in terms of location, is look and see what tribes are in your community, what tribal nations are near you, and see what they're doing to mobilize around the issue, because I'm pretty sure they're doing something. And some of this movement, like I said before, is even moving into urban areas or cities. And so if you, if you live in an area where there's a tribal population that's nearby, or you live near an urban center, I can guarantee that there's something like a Native center, or there's Native people there that are mobilizing around the issue. We really need to get the word out, so awareness is really critical, and also the historical piece is very critical, that people understand that this has it's been happening for a long time. And it's systemic, that we aren't just vulnerable populations, that we have been targeted historically to get to the point where we're at right now. So that's what I would definitely encourage if you know of any tribal communities close to you. Yes, Vancouver has a lot going on in terms of activities, so does Winnipeg. Yeah, there's a lot going on in there. And Phoenix, yeah. So you're in places where you probably hear a lot of this going on. Does anyone maybe feel like there's something that's gone on in their region that's been really helpful for them in gaining understanding about missing and murdered Indigenous women? And I also want to point out that allies are welcome in those spaces. I mean, you may want to talk to organizers, but from my experience at different social justice gatherings in different places, we're always welcoming allies, because as an ally, you have access to spaces that we don't sometimes, and you can carry this message into those spaces. Legislation is going to be a really key part of bringing together databases as well as organizing law enforcement. So we really want to make sure that this message is getting out in as many spaces as possible. Yes, spaces for Native students to talk is absolutely important. Here at the University of South Dakota, we have a Native American Cultural Center, which is actually where my office is located. And so we have that space for students to make food if they want, build community. It's a very much family-centered environment here. So that space for Native students to build community is absolutely important. In terms of lived experience with qualitative data, it's not my area, so I'm not really that comfortable stepping into that. And the other part that makes it really difficult talking about lived experience is the family. So I have not had a family member that went missing or was found murdered. I grew up in a place in Sioux City where we knew families that had gone through that experience, even in Sioux City. And so it's up to the families to tell their story. And I think that's part of just our experience as Indigenous people, that we don't want to tell someone else's story for them. And so it's really up to those families. Like you saw in the Meskwaki demonstration, Rita's family came forward and told her story. And that is really powerful. But I also know that Anita's database that she's collected, the families have given her consent to tell their story. So that is a lot more, I guess, detailed. And you can actually look up, Anita has just started an organization called the Sovereign Bodies Institute. And if you Google that, or you can find them on Facebook, there's a lot of qualitative research that she does as well, and quantitative research that she's done, and she collects as well. Student activism on college campuses is really important. And that's what we try and do here, is build community and make sure that our students' voices are heard. So yeah, there is absolutely a traditional or a custom element to having a voice. There's always, these spaces, and then you have multiple tribes that have different ways that they do things too. So we definitely, or how they grieve or how they mourn. It's even in my community, I lost my grandmother almost a year ago, and for a year we sit back from social events. We don't participate in doings, or we don't dance. And so it was even hard for me to speak at events, and I was being asked to speak and asked to talk, and I really struggled with that because I was still in mourning. And so you are a little bit just, you're just in a different place. And so that element of how we deal with our process of grieving or our process of losing a relative is definitely, there's a custom to that. And we as people are very consent-based. And so as if it's another family or if it's someone in another tribe, we just don't feel like we have the ability to speak to that unless we are given consent to do that. Okay, that is an awesome role, Carol, or awesome comment. So yes, so recently something that I've been seeing is some of the men stepping up and organizing events and taking the lead in those events. And I had to remind someone that I know that did that the women are at the center of this, right? And he's like, but I want to protect the women, and I understand that. But because patriarchy has also been infused into our communities through the boarding schools and through all of these other systems that were put into place, our men, although they want to be protectors, need to understand that we lead this. The women are leading this, and the men need to listen. And we also need, and this is something we're figuring out now, or I would say I'm figuring out now, is how do we hold our men accountable that may be even like doing things like womanizing or doing things that we know aren't right, and how do we hold them accountable in these spaces and still abide by our traditional ways of building community, right? So there's a lot of conversations that we're having now, and some of them are very new conversations. So yeah, there are spaces where men can organize things, but I don't think this is one of them. And I've also heard a lot of men saying, well, women need to do self-defense classes. And I'm like, you have women who are military trained that have been raped. It doesn't matter how much training you have in self-defense. That does not mean that you cannot be assaulted or found murdered. And so that's something that we're really just trying to give voice to in the community, is just educating, just basic educating people, and also trying to prevent victim blaming, which can happen if we have a relative that may not be well. And so that makes them more of a target because they may suffer from addiction or something else that that creates that those issues that come with that. So let's see, what else do we have? Is there a shared vision of achieving justice? Yes, there's absolutely can be distractors, and there absolutely can be infighting, and that's part of the movement that when we talk about is how do we always stay focused, right, on the work? How do we stay focused, and how do we let go of ego? And we have to, the place where we find that understanding is in our traditional way of life, because our traditional teachings teach us about removing ego. So for me, I can only speak for myself, but for me, I felt like I had no place speaking about MMIW. So I had people asking me and to speak, and I'm like, I don't have a relative who is missing. Like I can speak to things that I've gone through with domestic violence or abuse or healing. I can speak to that. So it was a process for me, even coming to the point where I can have these conversations. One thing that I realized very quickly when I speak, that it's never about Marissa Cummings. It's about the work that needs to be done. And so I had to shed my ego. I would get really nervous, or I get worked up before talking because I made it about myself. And once I sat down and prayed and I offered tobacco, and I talked to creation and just said, whatever message I'm supposed to give today to touch someone's heart and to touch someone's mind, help me relay that message. And so instead I made myself a vessel for those words, and I stopped making it about me. That's what I have tried to do to prevent infighting as well. And when I see egos kind of take take place, like, well, I'm a survivor, or so my story is more important than someone else's story. And I always try and remind us of those traditional teachings that we're relatives and that we really have to be good to one another, because there's so many people that have gifts, and we have to make sure that everyone's gifts are brought forward in this movement to really create change. So we talked a little bit about the crop and advocacy campaigns. Yeah, so there is something called a rematriation of seeds movement, and Rowan White has done a lot of work with that, as well as others. So reconnecting women to our traditional seeds and growing and creating relationship with these seeds again. So many of these seeds were actually taken from us and put in museums. And so reconnecting to those traditional food systems is also healthy. And so we're looking at an overall holistic wellness approach for our people. And so traditional crops absolutely play a role in that. It's my personal love. I grew these beans that I'm just Potawatomi beans that are actually beautiful, and bear beans, and I'm so in love with them. And so absolutely you can tie in women empowerment and also healing. So women that have gone through trauma, domestic violence, trafficking, to have them put their hands in the soil again, to reconnect with these baby seeds and to grow life from those seeds, and then to feed the people is a really beautiful healing mechanism as well. So there's definitely a lot of work that can go along with our traditional seed system. And advocacy campaigns. I would, instead of campaign, I'd probably use the word like work, because there's people that are, which would not be my skill set, but there's people that work specifically with trafficking victims, or there's people that work, you know, that are doing the on the ground, in the trenches work with domestic violence or sexual assault victims that are sitting with little girls as they talk to the FBI about being sexually abused. Those type of people I have the most respect for, because that work is so incredibly powerful and emotional. And so we, like I said before, we each have a gift, and I know some people have a gift for that, and I couldn't probably do that for a day. I would probably just be crying somewhere. So I just think that we each have a gift to use, and each of you has a gift too to carry this message forward in whatever spaces that you're in. So I appreciate that very much, that you all took the time to listen today.
All right, Marissa, thank you so much. I really appreciated learning more from you, as I have been doing for many years. So I appreciate the opportunity again. And just as a quick reminder to everyone here, thank you for your participation, like Marissa already mentioned. And if you are looking for credit, thanks, Rebecca. Here's the evaluation link. I believe, Rebecca, please speak to this if I'm saying the wrong thing. We will also email this out.
No.
Oh, just kidding. Go ahead, Rebecca.
Only if you request it. If you've attended and request it, we'll send it to you. But we don't send it to everybody who registered.
Okay. So here is the link. Fill out that evaluation. We really appreciate your feedback and your insights, and I hope that this inspires you to learn more and to find ways to be beneficial to continuing beneficial to your communities or other communities that are dealing with this horror. So thank you, Marissa. Is there anything else you want to say or share with us to close?
No, I just want to say thank you, everyone, again for your time. And I did put my email address in there if anyone has any specific questions after reflection that you wanted to address or talk about. I'm happy to answer any of those questions, and also provide resources if you need them. So thank you.
All right, thank you. And I believe we'll end now. Bye.
Thanks for watching. This video was produced by the National Network of Libraries of Medicine. Select the circular channel icon to subscribe to our channel. Select a video thumbnail to watch another video from the channel.